From both personal experience and my study of history, I found this to be true. Everything rises or falls on leadership. It's a well-known and oft-repeated maxim. For both leaders and followers, I want to share something that I hope proves an asset in your endeavor, whatever it is, most especially in the ministry of the local church. Now, I have to say that this isn't a scientific, research-based proposition. It's more of a proposal for you to consider. But I offer it because I found it to be tremendously helpful, as have others that I've shared it with. It's called the Prophet, Priest, King assessment. Assessments are generally helpful. Some assessments are good, others not so much. But every once in a while, you find one that's simply outstanding. It helps to be able to put a label on something, that is, to rightly identify it. Good assessments do that. They provide categories that can be helpful in identifying types and modes of leadership. Years ago, I heard someone speak on how, while Jesus is all three offices of prophet, priest, and king, we as his followers tend to gravitate to one of those. Some are prophets, some are priests, some are kings. And then the speaker gave an ultra-brief description of each of those modes of leadership, if you will. Now, as I listened, I found that what he said was compelling because, well, I could think of several people as he described kings, priests, and prophets. It turns out I knew some of each, and I was one of them. Now, I spent time pondering the subject, and the more I did, the clearer things became. I discovered that going back to the days of the early church, people have commented on the prophet, priest, king ministry of Jesus. And it made sense that as the Holy Spirit conforms us to the image of Christ, while only Jesus is the fulfillment of all three modes, individual believers would take on one or two of them. As they then lived and served in community, the fullness of Christ would be manifest. So I began paying closer attention to those that I lived and served with to see if I could discern which mode they operated in. Were they a king, a priest, or a prophet? And it didn't take long to discern which they were. It enhanced my appreciation for their part in the body of Christ and our relationship as I now knew them to better to relate to them. I began to see the need to develop a tool for them to discern what mode they were. The link below is the assessment that came of that. It's free to use. I have copyrighted it because I didn't want someone else duplicating it and then charging for it. It's free to use and to duplicate. I've used it for years where I serve as lead pastor. Others have used it in their churches and said how helpful it's been. I suggest that you stop the video here, download and print the assessment, and then come back and pick it up at this point. But please keep this in mind as you take the assessment. Answer your first inclination. Don't second guess yourself. Don't say, well, I would like to pick this one, but I think that I should pick this other. Assessments are only effective if people make their selections based on what's actually true of them, not what they wish they were or assume they ought to say. All too often, people naturally prefer one thing, but assume that if they were better or smarter or more mature, maybe more godly, they'd prefer something else. Assessments like this are skewed and unhelpful when people process them from an ought rather than is perspective. So after you've taken the assessment and processed the result, come back to the video where we will unpack the prophet, priest, and king modes, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of using this with a team. Okay, now that you've taken the assessment, let me share what I suspect you discovered. For most people, one of the modes will have received a higher score than the others. And for some, the difference between modes 1 and 2 is great, but for others, it's closer. Relatively rare are those who score a tie between two of the modes. There's usually a 4 to 5 point spread between 1 and 2. And worth noting is what comes in third. Now, we're going to come back to that later. For now, let's unpack the three modes. And we'll do that first by giving a quick comparison and contrast between the three. And then we'll go back and drill down on each of them. Prophets focus on the message. Priests tend to focus on the people, while kings focus on the mission. Prophets are those who approach leadership by informing and announcing. Priests lead by relationship. Kings lead by doing things, by engaging in tasks. Prophets, they like to speak at people. Priests prefer speaking with them. And kings want to mobilize people to do something. And while this rather overstates it, it still serves to place emphasis, I think, where it belongs. Prophets value truth, priests value feelings, and kings value results. I want to follow that up with a caveat. That does not mean the modes are uncaring about the other things. It means that when facing a challenge or a decision, each mode will tend to lean in that direction. In a toss-up between upholding truth or being careful with feelings or getting something done, prophets are going to make sure that truth isn't compromised. Priests are going to urge caution in how things impact people. And kings are going to say, what practical impact is this going to have? Let's talk now about prophets. Prophets tend to lead through communication. That communication being proclamation, declaration of the way that things should be. So prophets often tend to be visionary. They're preachers. They're comfortable being visible. They tend to have a larger audience and big ideas. They're gifted at teaching and may occasionally have a word of knowledge. Because of their emphasis on truth, they are prone to being harsh, and they can come off as cold and self-righteous in how much they know. Now, the more of a prophet someone is, the more distance they may approach their ministry by. Theirs is the air war, conducting things from afar. They generally do not like counseling, and when they do have to do it, they prefer to talk, dispensing answers they expect people to accept and follow through on. Now let's talk about priests. Priests lead through relationships. Theirs is the ground war, with ministry being up close and personal. They engage personally, caring for people face to face. As a result, they tend to have a smaller audience because they like to do things one-on-one. Priests are concerned with how people are doing. And to assess that, they need to check in with people. They like counseling, seeing it as the essence of what they're called to do. They will listen as much as talk. The priest's spiritual gifts include encouragement, mercy, and helps. Because priests are concerned with how people are doing, evaluating that largely by how people feel, they can have a tendency to tolerate sin. No, they don't go so far as to excuse it, but by silence may permit it. And just as prophets can be self-righteous in how much they know, priests can be self-righteous in how much they care. Well, let's talk about kings. Kings lead through strategy. Like prophets, kings tend to be visionary, but with a twist. They're strategic in going after their vision. They can see specific steps to make the vision reality. Kings often work behind the scenes, planning and coordinating activities to ensure that concrete results are produced. They build systems to that end and are ever at work to make those systems even more efficient. While the priest engages in an up-close and personal ground war and the prophet operates at a distance in an air war, the king is in logistics, making sure supplies get to the front lines. Kings see the big picture and know how each part plays a part. Kings are gifted with leadership, administration, and organization. And because results are so important to kings, they're prone to being rigid and rule-based, elevating methods over principles. They tend to be self-righteous with the useful policies that they've developed. Now, simplifying all of that, let's boil it down to this. Prophets are all about truth, priests are all about people, and kings are all about results. Kings build consensus to get things done. Priests want people to be okay, and prophets make sure truth is known. Now, I've not conducted a poll to nail down exact numbers, but from personal experience and feedback, prophets and priests each make up about 40% of people, while kings are 20%. Randomly pick 10 people, 4 will be priests, 4 prophets, and 2 kings. Now notice I said randomly pick 10 people. Those numbers don't work on a team that's been intentionally put together for reasons that we'll see a little bit later. For now, I want to consider how these three tend to interact. And as you may have already guessed, the greatest conflict is usually between prophets and priests. Priests can find prophets to be harsh, while prophets find priests to be too lenient or permissive. The priest may think that the prophet is a legalist, while the prophet returns the favor and regards the priest as compromising. And the whole time they're arguing over how to handle a situation, the king sits to the side and wonders when they're going to stop talking and do something. The real value of this assessment is this: in building a team. Less experienced leaders have a tendency to build a team of people like them. And this is normal. We tend to hang out with people for whom we share an affinity. So the young leader who's a prophet will tend to recruit and enlist other prophets. Now imagine a team of 5 or 6 where they're all prophets, no priests or kings. They're going to have some, deep theological discussions, but maybe not a lot of ministry to actual people. A team of a half dozen priests is likely to be super caring, but maybe always in the rescue or intervention mode. A team of kings is going to be very organized, but may not have much to do because, there aren't many people to do it. The wise leader will know what his mode is and will intentionally balance the members of the team to make sure that all the modes are represented. Discussions will value the differing perspectives of all 3 modes, realizing that it's only as they all work together that all the bases are covered. The prophet listens to the priest's input, knowing that the truth that he's so eager to promote, it has a real-world impact on people. It isn't just what's said that's important, how and when it's said is important too. The priest listens to the prophet's input, knowing that people he's so eager to see blessed must be led in the way of truth. It isn't just making sure that people know they're cared for. They must know that ultimately it's God who is caring for them by aligning them with His Word. In the first chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus is said to be full of both grace and truth. In lesser hands, grace and truth are pitted as opposing one another. Prophets, truth. Priests, grace. An effective team of ministers has a healthy representation of both perspectives, who know what their tendency is and how important it is for the overall health of their work to value both perspectives in equal measure. But if that team wants to make headway in impacting their community for God's glory, they need some kings who know, how to get things done. Kings are frustrated by prophets and priests who may think that merely talking is doing. That by saying a thing, whether from the pulpit or in the counseling office, they've done what was needed. Kings take the work of priests and prophets and organize it in such a way that results are tangible, lives are manifestly changed. What's often assumed by prophets and priests as a consequence of their work becomes visible through testimonies and lasting impact. Now, while this is a generalization, large churches tend to be led by a prophet who's good in the pulpit. Smaller churches are led by a priest, and they're smaller because their strength lies in their ability of the pastor to maintain relationships. That's a function of time and energy. Ministries that are making a significant impact in their community, guess what? They have a king that's coordinating their ministry. Let's turn now to the dynamic of that second or third mode. If your second mode is close to your first, it means that your primary mode will be shaped by the second. This is pretty intuitive, doesn't need a lot of explanation. A prophet king is a leader who casts a compelling vision and develops a plan for accomplishing it. A priest king is a leader who effectively develops others to assist in making sure that people are personally attended to. The king prophet mobilizes people to projects by preaching, while the king priest organizes people into care groups. Rare, but not unheard of, is the prophet priest or priest prophet. In my interaction with those who score close to the same in those 2 modes, they admit that they are often facing an internal struggle in how to proceed. You see, they value both truth and grace, and they wrestle with how to apply them. Once this gets worked out, these people tend to be amazing counselors and preachers who know how to say the hard thing in a most gracious way. They're able to convince people to take bitter medicine, but say it's sweet. Now, another aspect to think about here is, what is your third mode, the one that received the lowest score? It's important to identify what that is, because now you have something to note that you're probably not considering as you take your own counsel, and why it is so important for you to share what's going on so that you can get input from those that are stronger in that mode. Listen, I'm sure a lot more could be said. It's for you now to discover what that is. And I suggest that you have your entire leadership team take the assessment, share the results, and talk about how you can better value one another's contribution to your endeavor. A final word for senior leaders. If you realize that your team is skewed towards one of the modes, it would be good to round out your team with some of the others and make sure that their input is valued and respected.